Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Lee. I'm from the SANS Institute, and today we're going to be discussing the SANS Security Incident 2020. Next slide, please. Quick introductions of our speakers. My name's Rob. I'm the head of the faculty and the curriculum operations director for the SANS Institute, which basically means that my job is helping the instructors, authors, and the course content at SANS be delivered in an effective way. Just started as a full-time employee at SANS back in January, and formerly I was doing incident response and leading the digital forensics and incident response curriculum here at the SANS Institute, in addition to working in the incident response field for nearly 20 years. Formerly in the United States Air Force, worked in the US government, worked at Mandiant for multiple years, and then worked as a consultant in my own business, Harbingers LLC, for quite a few years. One of the things that I found on dealing with incidents, and a lot of them over the years, is basically that incidents are hard. And one of the things that I found in the courses that I teach and the author is that we have a really good mindset when it comes to recommending to others to share incident details and share a lot of the lessons learned as a part of those details. And that's one of the things that when SANS had this incident occur, which we'll start to go into in a few minutes, is that almost everyone I talked to at SANS landed on this concept that SANS is a teaching organization, and we, like any organization, are susceptible to many different types of attacks that occur online. And if we practice what we preach, which is we learn, we have the lessons learned, we have the follow-up, we should share that and a lot of those lessons learned with community. And that's really what we're aiming to do today. This presentation is targeted to walk everyone who's attending through what are the key details of what the incident was, how it happened, how we got phished, what happened behind the scenes, and talk about some of those lessons learned, both from a technical perspective and human perspective, as what's going to help us drive forward. Joining me today and helping me out with the presentation is Mike Pilkington, who works in our research and operations capability called SANS SROC. And he's also formerly and also an incident responder working in the digital forensics incident response community, also for many years. Mostly in the energy sector. He used to do IR for large-scale energy companies such as Halliburton and BP. So he has been there and seen a lot of incidents too. And then finally joining me is Lance Spitzner, also, without a doubt, one of the foremost experts on security awareness and the human side to helping build correct security awareness programs across the board. And in sitting down with Mike and Lance, we're really trying to drive this theme that this incident is, while it happened, and while we sit there and cannot ignore the facts that, we're really regrettable about the details of the incident, we do want to, go back on what we actually preach in our classrooms, which is we want to share, we want to learn, and we want to have a massive amount of follow-up that is going to occur in the community is about this discussion of what happened to us and how we could share that with other organizations. So you could also take a look at it and see how would we have prevented this ourselves. So next slide. So to kick things off, I'm going to give a basic overview of some of the details that we already covered in our lead up to this webcast. So the basics of the incident are this. So back on the 24th of July, 2020, there was a phishing email that was received. Now this email was actually sent to about 17 different individuals inside SANS at that point. And we later discovered that during the investigation, and Lance and Mike are going to go into that a little bit more detail. One of the users who's not a part of security, not a part of IT, one of our users, we have 400 employees at SANS, one of our users clicked on that email. And that basically set up a forwarding rule. Now that forwarding rule was detected on 6 August. So it's about a week and a half of dwell time where that forwarding rule was enabled. And Mike will go through how we determined that there's no malware in the host and how we were able to narrow it down to just one victim system here. But all in all, this is where things get really regrettable. During that time frame that the forwarding rule was active, there were 513 emails that were forwarded to a suspicious external email address. Now, if you end up looking below there, you actually see, as a part of our IOC's indicators of compromise that we released, the exact email address where this was forwarded to. Most of the emails that were forwarded out were completely harmless or just normal employee back and forth emails, but some of the emails, they contain PII data. That data, which the majority of it, ironically, came from the Digital Forensics and Incident Response Summit. Majority of the people that were affected by that and were also notified were the attendees of that summit. And that was forwarded out to that email address. Now, what was contained in that PII data? As you see on the right-hand side of the screen, email, work title, your first and last name, work phone, company name, the industry, address, and country of residence. We actually had some folks come back and say, well, that doesn't constitute real PII. It's like soft PII. Honestly, it doesn't matter to us. We lost customer and registration information. And regardless of the form that it came in, we've felt the strong need that we have to do proper notifications and basically say this event happened. It's extremely regrettable, and we had a lot of lessons learned as a part of this. So I'm going to flip it over to Mike Pilkington, who's going to lead us through what the investigation looked like from the side. And Mike helped lead the investigation.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. I am looking forward to talking to you about what we discovered and how we discovered it. I actually want to start by saying too that this was absolutely a team effort. I played a role in it, but we had pretty much an all hands on deck mentality to this. As soon as it was discovered as a fairly significant issue, we had at least probably a dozen IT people, both in security and IT general, just kind of tearing apart logs, eventually tearing apart the workstation from a forensic standpoint, and really just a lot of people put a lot of hours into determining what happened here. So I was one of those, but happy to share with you some of our findings. I want to talk about first, how did this come on our radar? What happened to trigger the investigation? And it really boiled down to, fortunately, some proactive measures we did. So this is, there are some wins, but there are some losses in this story. But one win is that we did take some active steps to look for unusual configurations, to look specifically at O365 rules, forwarding rules. And one definitely bubbled up pretty quickly and significantly to us during this review. We're looking at a snippet of the output from a PowerShell script that's run against the Office 365 environment, and at the top with a command we did anonymize the mailbox that this came from. But during the review, this particular rule for this user did show up and showed some pretty concerning characteristics. It's basically, as you can see in the top kind of blue highlighted section, that it's looking for keywords related to banking, financial type activities, wiring info, SWIFT related to international wiring, and other keywords. And any of those keywords that are found in the subject of the body are going to be forwarded onto the email address at the bottom, which was probably pretty clearly not an email address we would expect to find. And so all of this together really raised the alarms and kind of set off the incident response process. The initial part of the investigation was almost solely a 365 log review. And so, that's what initially triggered the investigation. And then digging deeper, we did find quite a few things that were really helpful to kind of validate and track down exactly what occurred. At the top, well, actually thinking about what you saw on the previous slide, there was the rule, and there was a rule that the name was, I believe, anti-spam or something like that. But basically, the rule name was determined, and we found kind of a timeline of when that was. And so we started obviously looking at what else happened within O365 for this user at that time. And this was on July 24th. And right around that time was an unusual Office 365 app. It was one that no other user in our organization had. It's called Enable for Excel. And immediately became suspicious and a potential culprit here. One of the really cool things, I'm going to go back actually just a bit. One of the really cool things that did come out of these logs that helped us a lot was, obviously the time. So once we have a time frame, we can start to dig deeper into the host and figure out, what was going on around that time frame. But also, if you look on the right, kind of middle right, you see the details and the device info. So I'll just point out that the Auth 365 logs were really helpful in that regard. It's definitely possible that the user can have multiple systems, maybe even multiple devices, whether it's a phone or a workstation. But this really pinpointed to us that we needed to start with the Windows 10 host, and the Chrome details there were actually accurate as well. So we even kind of knew which browser to focus on, and so that speeded things up a bit. And then finally, at the bottom actually was from a different set of logs. It's really an audit log query that was done in Office 365, but it was related to the Enable for Excel. It highlighted a URL that was clearly pretty suspicious looking, and it's tied directly to that Enable for Excel. So this gave us another starting point into the investigation of the workstation. All right, and so this is where it kind of transitioned to myself and Mark Hallman I work closely with, and SROC. We kind of took the endpoint, the device forensics, specifically the Windows 10 workstation, and really tried to take that URL that you saw just previously related to Enable for Excel and see is there any evidence of that being clicked or that being accessed from the workstation. And long story short, we really tore the system apart. We really, there was no indication for the logs that this had spread to any other users. So we weren't terribly concerned at this point about, lateral movement and things of that nature, at least not yet. But so we really focused on this system. We ended up finding specifically that, yes, there was evidence of that Enable for Excel URL being accessed. And on top of that, we found another strange looking URL that you're seeing straight in the middle here that was, closely tied to that. There's several different pieces of evidence related to that. Further research, we end up finding, okay, this is actually the source of the activity. And it basically, that URL in the middle is the URL for this open button that's on the email at the right. So that email is the phishing email that was received by the user. With all of our analysis, we end up finding 17 users receive that email address, or sorry, receive that phishing email in basically the exact same format. Very enticing, link there for accessing copy of July bonuses for the current date. That was the date that it was sent, and basically says, open this to authorize access or get access to it. So what we ended up finding is that, yes, we validate that the user clicked open. And once they did, subsequently, there were several different interactions, but mostly at that point with the URL that came from Enable for Excel. In other words, came from the malicious app. And what we saw a lot of is evidence of these access tokens, which are essentially a URL themselves to Microsoft Online, but in it, it tags access to the particular application via this URL associated with Enable for Excel, and also includes, importantly, the permissions that is granted to this access token. And you can see in yellow some pretty significant access that was granted, and on the right is not the actual authorization that was seen by the user, but it's an example of one from a write-up from Microsoft. We'll talk a little bit more about this technique and some of the literature out there about it, but basically, for the most part, those almost kind of correlate one for one about the app, the permissions being requested by the app, and then what you can actually see from the URL, from the analysis of the browser activity.
Hey, Mike, you might want to explain, was there any malware involved at this point?
That's a good point, Lance. So no, we were fortunate. In fact, maybe go back a slide and we'll just say that it might be a little, this one might be a little difficult to tell by looking at this, but there was no attachment on this system, on this this email. That is just a a little graphic in the middle saying that if you want to access this copy of the July bonus Excel file, you need to open this link and essentially grant access. There was never an Excel file. The Excel file was not located on the system. There was no malware downloaded to the system. It was specifically a ploy to get access to the user's mailbox, and it worked in this case, unfortunately. So what is this attack? Further research, we found that it's becoming fairly common basically this year. There was some write-ups really at the end of last year, December, and going into this year. In fact, there was a big write-up. The first link that's in the references there is one from Microsoft that came out last month. That this is becoming more common, and obviously, the challenges of working from home and things of that nature have probably made it more appealing type of attack for the attackers. But what they are terming this as a consent phishing attack. So there is no malware involved. It is literally just requesting access into the O365 account, and if the user's not paying close enough attention, then they can grant that access, and the attackers have access to the server side, but not to the client side. We did a lot of investigation on that workstation, and no indications that malware was installed on it. But they had indeed clicked the phishing link and also authorized the access to this malicious app. The last point there, that we put in a couple references, or 3 references there, all of which we found pretty interesting and useful, and really basically described our incident to a T. But the last point there is, one of the reasons that attackers are using this, and that it can be quite effective, is because it really defeats multi-factor authentication. It doesn't matter how the user authenticates. They could use 5 different factors, but once they're authenticated, they can grant access to the malicious app, if the account is able to do so. And that is definitely a lesson learned for us, is that we need to really track that more closely and lock that down. But unfortunately, we let this one get by. The end user was able to authenticate it. The other thing to point out, and this goes to Lance's question about, did we find malware? Was there any indications of malware, even files on the disk? There was not, which meant there was really nothing for antivirus to detect. Okay, so we didn't get AV alerts, and really is not something that AV would be able to detect that I'm aware of. So kind of just to sum up, what we did discover is that, this is kind of a newer attack surface, and makes a lot of sense to get around, things like AV and multi-factor, so it is a somewhat sophisticated attack, but it was not a targeted attack. We were confident of that because of a couple of factors. One being that, we really looked at all the employees who received this email, and they were from all different parts of the business, even though that clearly the rule that was enabled by that Office 365 add-on was related to finance. The user that clicked it was not in finance, fortunately, and many of the users that received it were not in finance. There also, basically was no other indication of unusual behavior. It did seem more of kind of an opportunistic, like basically it logged in, just long enough or authorized long enough to create the rule, but there was no actual logins from anywhere that were unexplained, or other activity related to this account that was unexplained. Again, just kind of really emphasizing that this was more of an opportunistic attack. And finally, we felt this way doing the analysis, but as we've done the disclosure and talked to a number of people, I personally have talked to a couple of people who have shown and discussed almost the exact same phishing attack that they had received, and actually in one case even exactly the same phishing campaign. So it was opportunistic, basically a financial play. We were fortunate in that sense. So this could have been targeted, and certainly other organizations might face similar attacks in a more targeted nature, but nothing in our case indicated that it would be. Last thing for me to talk about is just, we've already released all of these indicators, but we want to put in the slide deck here as well. But these are kind of some of the key things that we observed from both the phishing email itself, as well as the malicious app. Probably the only thing that I haven't really even mentioned, I think we've looked at all of this just about, but number 4 is the phishing email headers return path. And I can tell you that in talking with some other people and looking at some of the phishing emails they received, they actually had almost an identical return path in the phishing email headers that they had. So that was kind of an interesting one to correlate, like down to HostWin's VM and almost not the exact same server, but very, very close.
So I'll pick back up here, and Mike, really thank you for that. And just a note on this, a lot of the technical stuff, and I nerd out on that a lot. Like, how did this attack happen? What happened? How did it get there? Talking with Mike and team, we have a lot of folks that kind of spread the spectrum. Mike is an instructor at SANS, and he's also working for SANS on the research side. And we brought him in to help us do this incident. But it really notes that, a lot of our, security and IT workforces that's inside SANS are not full-time instructors. A lot of our full-time instructors are actually out there being practitioners, consultants, working for other companies. So we're very fortunate that during incidents like this, we're able to start leveraging a lot of that expertise and help us, do that response. But it also leads to this concept is like, hey, you're SANS, you're one of the top information security leaders and training capabilities in the entire world. How did you potentially get hit with this? And the answer to that question is we, just like everyone else, are facing the same technical hurdles and challenges. A lot of those got exacerbated specifically by COVID. Now, these are not excuses in any way. Just one of these things when you go back and look at this, it highlights how hard this stuff is. Especially now that COVID happened. Take, for example, we have 400 employees. They're all mostly working from home. Most of them are not only working on their laptops, a lot of them are accessing software as a service capabilities like O365. In researching this, with this attack, could it have been done on any device that you have that's capable of reading email into O365? The answer to that question, from what we've been able to determine, is yes, that the OAuth side to that part of the attack could have happened on the individual's mobile device as much as it happened on their laptop, which really brings into focus, like, man, this is hard. And it is causing SANS to reflect, especially in a remote workforce, how are we not only securing the endpoints, but the software as a service models, having the appropriate logging, but also, as Lance is going to get into, making sure that the training, the human factor side of that is also met. Because some people think, oh, it's my cell phone, I could click on anything, it's no big deal. Well, that's not true. We have to look at every potential one of these access points that are accessing these SaaS applications online as a potential entry point. All it takes is one, and that's one of the biggest lessons learned here, is that all it takes is one person to click on the link. Even though there are 17 individuals we know that received that email during our investigation, we still found all it takes was one to have that forwarding rule established. Now, as we also noted here, there was no malware when investigating the endpoints. We had a lot of that stuff down, but then it still is one of those very self-reflective look in the mirror moments in which we look back and say, we're not doing enough. We need to do better at this. We need to learn from this experience and double down on how we're protecting our remote workforce even more than we have before. Everyone who's listening to this call right now is like saying, yeah, that could be us. And it is us in this case. That is what we're looking at here. And talking to the other instructors across all SANS faculty, the lesson learned is trying to integrate that. Now, do you close down all of your SaaS applications? Do you tell everyone, we're gonna lock everyone down? And there's really that availability security balance that every organization is trying to adhere to. And as a result of that, while we dump a lot of money into this cost of securing our infrastructure and applications, it still shows us that all it takes is a one little thing to occur, and we're dealing with a 28,000 PI data loss. And it's one of those self-reflective moments that in here that we have to go back and do another self-assessment on how much we need to lock that down versus make it available. Do we allow for personal devices? In the time of COVID, everyone's working from home across multiple devices on their personal laptops, personal phones. What's the right balance that we need to strike there? And we're going to be reflecting on that a lot in order to prevent these in the future. The final thing is also as a self-reflective, the SaaS providers, everything's sitting in the cloud. This is the thing we preach in our classes, and we really are trying to strike the right balance as to what can be done and what is now available. The thing about cloud, and I talked to Frank Kim, who heads up our cloud curriculum, and a lot of folks in there and do response for the cloud. Cloud isn't something that once you deploy it, it is the same thing from where you started to where it's going to be later, meaning that things that you may think be enabled for logging capabilities, security detections are consistently changing. And it's one of those things that every organization has to go through and say, do I have the adequate logging? It almost feels like your cell phone plan. You almost need to constantly go into your cell phone plan to make sure, do I have the best deal? And if not, we need to go back and reflect it. Sometimes the vendors do not even notify you on some of the new capabilities that are available. So, depending on how many applications you have out there, that's something SANS struggles with as well, is how do we mitigate all of that? Now, our quick lessons learned on this, as we mentioned before, is it ties into, in addition to the technical side to this, we do need to focus in on the human side, because as much as we like to talk about, hey, we can protect everything, no one needs to worry about it, you're sitting under the shield and you don't have to worry about any bad things happening, that's not exactly the case. So we invited Lance to talk about the human side of the security umbrella here as well. So Lance.
All right. Hey, thanks, Rob. Hey, folks, my name is Lance Spitzner. I am a director at SANS Security Awareness, and I'll be sharing some of the strategic lessons, but from a human perspective. All right. First, security awareness is nothing more than another control to help manage risk, specifically your human risk. So you want to be sure it is aligned with and an extension of your technical controls. My concern is sometimes I see in organizations where the security awareness is siloed and operates separately from the security team. You want to make sure both are very much integrated and working together at a strategic level. Now, a second one, a big part of security awareness is training our workforce how to behave securely and interact with technology. We manage risk by ensuring people exhibit secure behaviors. But you also may want to partner with your security team. Security teams tend to be very technical. Workforces tend to be very non-technical. So what happens is when the security team is interacting with your workforce, sometimes things can be lost in translation. So we want to help our security teams to effectively communicate with our workforce. Also, in a lot of ways, security awareness is like vulnerability management. It is a continuous, ongoing, daily process. You can never slow down. Really, the only difference is you're not securing the Linux or the Windows operating system. You're securing the human operating system. So that it is a continuous, ongoing process. But a couple of tactical or operational takeaways I'd like to share with you very briefly also. First, we can't teach people every single attack possible. There are simply too many ways for bad guys to target people. And to be honest, the bad guys are always changing and updating them. So really one of our challenges is finding the common indicators that many of these attacks share and focusing on those common indicators. So for example, when it comes to phishing, focus on indicators like tremendous sense of urgency, curiosity, or pressure for people to bypass or ignore your policies and procedures. Those are big indicators. So for a specific attack like this, I would not recommend running out and teaching the people details or the specifics of this specific attack. Instead, focus on what are some of the common indicators. So in this case, it's not only the actual phishing email itself, but the idea once they click, they get all these pop-up messages about enabling or accepting all these permissions. teach your people if something like that happens, that is a big indicator that something bad has happened and is most likely an attack. Quite often, one of the biggest challenges I run into in in security awareness is making security simple for our workforce. And that's really hard to do. Finally, what's really interesting is when it comes to having your security team communicate to your workforce, I want to share with you just one example. So during the recovery process, some of our security members were communicating with some of our workforce about the phish. And they would send the workforce, these individuals, an email explaining the phish to include information like the header, the subject, and things like that. That may work well for the security team who's technical, but we have to remember our workforce is non-technical. So instead of sending an email that explains the phish, remember most people are visual, include a screenshot of the phish so people can actually see what you're talking about. And the other thing too is go beyond just email. Use technologies like Slack or Microsoft Teams for a more personal, interactive, and responsive interaction with members when you need some specific information. That's about it, Rob. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Lance. So in conclusion here, and there's a couple things I want to hit upon. If you get the next slide. Yeah. Please direct questions to info@sans.org. But in conclusion, when we talk about this, this is one of those situations that, again, as a part of SANS, extremely regrettable that we had PI data loss, and it did happen to us. But it also highlights the ability for what I truly believe when I look at SANS, which is gives us an opportunity to share about what we learn and practice what we preach. It's really trying to educate the community about how these events work. Just like any professional sports athlete, any of the quarterbacks that are out there that are the really good ones, that they don't go back in the day after they play the game and say, even if they won the game, there's always that point in the game that they said, how did I miss that? How did I miss that receiver that was downline? How did I miss not seeing that sack that came and clipped me from behind? And they pour over the videos and trying to replay in their heads how they might have gotten ahead of it. And that's exactly one of the things I appreciate about SANS in this regard, is that we are being extremely thoughtful and extremely adamant about what we're doing to try and do that. In this case, as we mentioned before, any organization, including myself, if someone wanted to phish me or phish you or anyone else out there, it isn't really likely to occur. Someone is going to click on a link at some point, and we have to not only train our individuals to make sure that, hey, what is the data that you're attaching to emails? What is the data that's stored on your local devices? The indicators that Lance was talking about, saying something's not right here about this. Why is it asking me to change my permissions on it? But it exasperates how hard this stuff actually is. But it also gives us an ability to circle back and saying, this did happen. It's regrettable. And the lessons learned here is that we can improve and we are going to get better, not only on training the workforce, but also looking at all of our applications, endpoints, and capabilities inside SANS, and doubling down on how to prevent these attacks. My name's Rob Lee, and on behalf of Mike Ilkington and Lance Spencer, I thank you for attending this session. This will be posted to YouTube, so anyone can watch it a little bit later. So if you're trying to forward this on to anyone else, they would be able to see the webcast archive here very shortly. Thank you for attending, and see you at the next SANS training event.